birds got into the metal roof.
That was the vent as it comes out of the roof, and they put a nest up there. Plugged it up. Everybody in the foyer, please come into the auditorium. I'll give you 3 seconds. 3, 2. Anybody tired of the cold weather yet? Anybody tired of the cold weather yet? You go out in it and do anything? Oh, good, good. One of our heaters is not working. Out of the vent, a bird got up in there and made a nest. And somehow I got to climb up on that roof. I didn't want to do it yesterday because it's water up there. Thinking about getting one of my grandkids to do it. I got 6 of them, you know, so if something happens, we still got 5. Yeah, it's horrible. Welcome to the real world. Okay, we got 2 classes left today and next Sunday. We're in 2 Corinthians. We're in chapter 11. We were in we did chapter 10 in the first part of chapter 11 last week. Of course, remember that 2 Corinthians rehashes a lot of subjects that were introduced in 1 Corinthians, right? And here in chapter 11, we see Paul kind of defending his apostleship again. In fact, that theme continues into chapter 12. And we've already seen, revisited, you know, the collection. And the guy that was in committing fornication. And those were pretty positive. But you got to ask yourself, when he's revisiting this thing about his apostleship, why he would need to continue still to defend that. Because sometimes things simmer below at a lower level. And I think he knew that and knew there was still perhaps some problems there. But anyway, we'll look at it in more detail. It would behoove us, though, to look back at verse 1 of chapter 11. Would that you could bear with me in a little foolishness. I meant to bring my New International Version this morning, and I forgot. But what we'll see here is in this text, he's going to sort of take himself out of the position of the apostleship and humility and say some things that, as we'll see, that where it might look like he's bragging about himself a little bit, but he's not. He's just Ray. Just hold on to it. When I get to a text, I might have you read it, or I'll read John's here. Thank you, though. We see in verse 2, jealous over you with godly jealousy, I espouse you to one husband, that I might present you as a pure virgin to Christ. We looked at it. Verse 3, unless you become beguiled like the serpent, the snake, beguiled Eve. Verse 4, he that comes preaches another Jesus whom we did not preach, and that would be Judaizing teachers, right? If you receive a different spirit, we skip down to verse 6, which is, I think, about where we're at. For though I be rude or not eloquent in speech, yet am I not in knowledge. And so that was the thing that we looked at in chapter 10, verse 1, I who in your presence am lowly among you, but being absent am of good courage. Chapter 10, verse 10, for his letters, they say, are weighty and strong, but his bodily presence is weak, his speech of no account. Then that thought is continued here in verse 6, though I be rude in speech or not eloquent, yet am I not in knowledge. And in every way, we've made that manifest unto you in all these things. So we're getting a little bit about Paul's personal presence and how he, and the things that he got back to him about what they were saying about him. Now, verse 7, or did I commit a sin in abasing myself that you might be exalted because I preached to you the gospel of God for naught or nothing? He did not take any wages. Verse 8, I robbed other churches, taking wages of them that I might minister unto you. So if we look back quickly at 1 Corinthians, in chapter 1, we see this thing where some of them are saying, I'm baptized by Paul, Apollos, Cephas, Jesus Christ. So they're elevating other preachers above Paul, who some of them considered that he wasn't really an apostle, because they didn't like his teaching on not requiring Greek Christians to be circumcised and all those other attributes of Judaism. And then if we look in chapter 3, Paul planted, Apollos watered, God gives the increase. He tells that story about no foundation can a man lay but Jesus Christ. Be careful how you build on it. And so these Judaizing teachers were building combustible materials. And he said there at the end of that section that if any man's building endures, he'll have a reward. Obviously, the Judaizing teachers would not. And then we go to chapter 9, where this subject is reintroduced in 1 Corinthians. Verse 2, if I'm not an apostle yet, at least I am to you, for the seal of mine apostleship are you in Jesus Christ. And then the whole thing is about how workers in the gospel should be reimbursed or should be maintained so that they can be free to preach the gospel. But he did not take that right over them. And what was the reason for that? Because in chapter 9, he's all things to all men. Chapter 9, verse 21, to them that are without law is without outlaw, not being without law to God, and all those things. To the weak I became weak, to the strong I became strong. And so he knew that in this particular work, where some people question his apostleship, and that it would not have been advantageous to his work to take wages from them. And so he made the gospel of Christ free. He says, in fact, he says he robbed other churches, as we'll read here in 2 Corinthians chapter 11. So when in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 7, did I commit a sin in abasing myself that you might be exalted because I preached to you the gospel of God for naught? I robbed other churches, taking wages of them that I might minister unto you. He didn't steal or rob other churches, except in the sense that they supported him financially when it wasn't their duty to do so. It was the Corinthians' duty to support him. But so in that sense, he was maintained by those things. Of course, we know if we look back in where is it? Acts 18, when the church in Corinth was established, what was he doing? What was his secular income? He's a tent maker. So that's what he was doing when he first arrived there, okay? But then that should have evolved into not spending time making tents, but the church in Corinth supplying him with his monetary needs. But because there's those there that were very critical of him, he didn't take that. And then in Acts 19, oh, we're not ready for that yet. Okay. So he took wages from other congregations to help in that work in Corinth. For the brethren, at the end of verse 9, I was not a burden on any man, for the brethren, when they came from Macedonia, supplied the measure of my want, and in everything I kept myself from being burdensome unto you, and so will I keep myself. So if you're a Corinthian and you're hearing this, what would you think, a member of that church, what would you think about that? Be proud of it? Be embarrassed about it? Josh, what do you think? Amen, brother. I know what you're thinking. You might be a little bit embarrassed, right? To be reading that. And because they're a little bit further along in their path of faith, they're growing closer to the stature of Jesus Christ. And if they're reading these words that you should have been supporting me, but I couldn't take wages from you because of this element of people questioning his teaching and his apostleship. And so at this point, they should be a little embarrassed by that. In verse 10, as the truth of Christ is in me, no man shall stop me of this glorying in the regions of Achaia. Why? Wherefore? Because I love you not, God knows, but what I do, that I will do, that I may cut off occasion from them that desire an occasion, for wherein they glory, they may be found even as we are. And then in verse 13, false apostles are introduced. And so we think back to 1 Corinthians 9, I became all things to all men that I might gain a few. So in his work in Corinth, he didn't take wages. Other congregations supported him. And he was not going to give any reason for people to be critical of his ministry. Now, in verse 13, for such men are false apostles, deceitful workers, fashioning themselves into apostles of Christ, and no marvel, no wonder, for even Satan fashions himself into an angel of light. It is no great thing, therefore, if his ministers also fashion themselves as ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. Look at this. And what Paul is saying, that you've got some people there who are false apostles. Who would those people be? In that congregation, who would they be? Those Judaizing teachers, and trying to elevate themselves and making themselves into an apostle. And so Paul says that those are really ministers of Satan, right? Because he's already argued this point, both in Jerusalem and here, that he is an apostle, and that the Greek Christians don't need to be circumcised or keep up with any of the other elements of Judaism. So that issue has been logically and intellectually settled, but sometimes people, like a dog, don't want to give up a bone, and so Paul knows that. He's had reports, household of Chloe, and he sent people there like Titus, and so he knows some of this is going on. So he has to address this again. And in fact, when we look at this and we ponder, was he successful at it? Obviously so, right? We don't have Judaizing Christians today. And so that was something that was a problem in that day and time. We can certainly learn from it, but no longer is it a problem. But we should look at this because the secondary application, false apostles. And by the way, we should look at this thing about apostles. And when we think about apostles, we think about the 12 apostles, right? And then Paul also as an apostle, but other people in the New Testament were called apostles, right? What does that word apostle mean? One sent like a messenger, but more of an emissary or an envoy to take the gospel to different places. And as we look in the subsequent centuries, you'd have people in non-biblical literature, but you'd have people called the apostle to Great Britain, the apostle to this country, the apostle to that country. That's not the same as one of the apostles, one of the 12, or the apostle Paul, but there is a sense in which people are called apostles that that is not actually one of those type of apostles who actually witnessed Jesus Christ and walked with Jesus Christ. We see that in Acts. We won't look at all this. Acts 14, maybe we will later. Acts 14:14, Romans 16:7, 1 Thessalonians, Silas, people like that are called apostles. So false apostles, and if people could fashion themselves as false apostles in that day and time as an envoy or an emissary, certainly they could do that, and on a lower level as people who are promoting Jesus Christ as teachers and preachers, right? And it says this, that Satan can fashion himself into an angel of light. The naive or the simple-minded, he can. And so it's no big deal to understand that Satan's ministers can also fashion themselves as ministers of righteousness. Now, those people, those Judaizing teachers who repented of that false notion, they'd be good guys. They'd be Team Jesus Christ. But the ones that held on to that are squarely in the camp of Satan, and they're like ministers of Satan. It may look good, it may sound good, but when you measure what they have to say with what's revealed in the scriptures, they're ministers of Satan. And he concludes verse 15, whose end shall be according to their works. They're going to get their due when the time comes. Any thoughts to this point before we start verse 16? Yes, sir, Ricardo. Yeah, and the classic verse to look at this is 1 Timothy 4, right? Where you've got some Christians saying some things. 1 Timothy 4, verse 1, Spirit says expressly, later times some shall fall away from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits, doctrines of demons. The hypocrisy of men speak lies, branded in their own conscience. What are they saying? They're forbidding Christians, forbidding other Christians to marry, commanding them to abstain from meats, which God created to be deceived with thanksgiving by them that believe and know the truth. So, I mean, here we see illustrated some specific doctrines that these false teachers were teaching. They looked like Christians, they sounded like Christians, but they're teaching some things that were just absolutely wrong. Oh, yeah, we do. Religions that have other books, Pearl and Covenant, Doctrines of Great Price, Latter-day Saints, you know, and all sorts. Yes, we do. And so that's why, I mean, that may not be the primary application of this, but it's certainly a valid secondary application. When we think about Satan disguising himself as a minister of righteousness and his minions, his followers, doing the same thing, and those are defined as people who maybe have been shown the truth but reject it and keep teaching the wrong. Okay. And the other verse that we would customarily think about is Acts 20, around about verse 28, when Paul tells the Ephesian elders, false teachers will come up from among your midst, from among yourselves. And why? To develop a following and so divide the church. So definitely a problem then and today. Okay, so let's look at verse 16. I say again, let no man think me foolish, but if you do, yet as foolish receive me, that I also may glory a little bit. And so he says, what does the NIV say here, John? Verse 16? You want me to read it, since I got the speaker. Is that Wordle you're looking at?
No. I repeat, let no one take me for a fool. But if you do, then tolerate me just as you would a fool, so that I may do a little boasting.
Okay, so he's going to take on the role of a fool here, just to say some things about himself and to illustrate a point to them. Verse 17, that which I speak not after the Lord, but as foolishness, in this confidence of glorying. See that many glory after the flesh, I will glory also. So you have these false teachers glorying after the flesh, and Paul says, let me have a hand at that just for a little bit. Let me use that device. And he tells them in 19, you bear with the foolish gladly, being wise yourselves, for you'll bear with a man if he brings you into bondage, if he devours you, if he takes you captive, if he exalts himself, if he strikes you on the face. And so that reminds me then of 1 Corinthians chapter 5, where Paul says they were glorying in that situation where a guy is having a sexual relationship with his father's wife. And where they should have been embarrassed and ashamed and done something like getting him out of their, away from the congregation. And eventually they would, of course. But they would bear with that and even perhaps somehow glory about it. But verse 21, he says, I speak by way of disparagement as though we, and plural pronoun, Paul and whoever was working with him at that time, yet wheresoever any is bold, again, he speaks in foolishness, I'm bold also. So here goes. Here's a litany of the things that would almost look like pride, but he's just revealing these things, mimicking these Judaizing teachers. Are the Hebrews? Me too. Israelites? I am too. Seed of Abraham? Yep. Are the ministers of Christ? And parenthetically, he says, I speak as one beside myself. Are they ministers of Christ? I more. In labors more, abundantly, in prisons, in stripes. Of the Jews, 5 times I was beaten 39 times. 3 times was I beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I suffered shipwreck. A night and a day have I been in the deep. In journeyings often. In perils of rivers, in perils of robbers, in perils from my own countrymen, Jews. In perils from the Gentiles, in perils in the city, in perils in the wilderness, in perils of the sea, in perils among false brethren, in labor and travail, watchings often, hunger and thirst, fastings, cold, naked. Besides this, things that are without, there is that which presses upon me daily, anxiety for all the churches. Who's weak and I'm not weak? Who's caused to stumble and I burn not? So if I must needs glory, I will glory of the things that concerns my weakness. So what do you think the point is for him listing all these? Right. And so what you would have here is got these false teachers who are teaching these false things and promoting themselves. And he said, all right, let me glory a little bit. Let me list all these things, and you bring what you got. Can you list those things? They couldn't begin to. Because they were preaching Christ out of selfishness and pride. And probably in those days, if a false teacher was being whipped up on by the Jews, he might say, well, I'm really a Jew. I want to teach, circumcision, things like that. So Paul shows in a very distinctive way how he is distinctively different than these Judaizing teachers. And these false teachers within that congregation were elevating and promoting himself, who were really ministers of Satan. So you remember this word anxiety. If you mark that throughout this letter, it's really, you really see it in the first chapter, and anxiety and sufferings and afflictions, where he introduces that. A lot of times in a technical paper, the introduction is just sort of a restatement of the whole thing, and the conclusion is a restatement of that as well. And so you get that introduced in the first chapter. Now we see the details of it. Okay? So, but in verse 30, he says, if I need to glory, I will glory of the things that concern my weakness. God and Father of the Lord Jesus, he who is blessed forevermore, knows that I lie not. So he says, he's using this as a device to illustrate the difference between him and these false teachers. He says, but what I glory in is the things related to their salvation and his ministry and his duty as a Christian. Then he references in verse 32, in Damascus, the governor under Aretas, the king, guarded the city of Damascus, people that lived in Damascus, in order to take me. And through a window was I let down in a basket by the wall and escaped his hands. And that reference point is Acts 19:25. All right, that's chapter 11, but it continues into chapter 12. Anything else that we need to mention about that? Okay. So in chapter 12, I must needs glory, though it is not expedient. And so here's another episode of Paul glorying. And it really stimulates our minds and think, what is this? And but it's also going to show the distinctiveness between him and these false teachers. So verse 1, I must needs glory, though it is not expedient, but I will come to visions and revelations of the Lord. Verse 2, I know a man in Christ. This has got to be Paul, right? And so he's not mentioning his name, but I think the strong implication is that Paul's talking about himself. I know a man in Christ, or in a relationship with Christ, 14 years ago, and he says, whether in the body, I know not, or whether out of the body, I know not, God knows. And so he must have had some revelation. He says, I don't know if I was physically there, or it was just something that God revealed to him, maybe in a dream. Such a one caught up even to the third heaven. What's the third heaven? Okay, but is there the first and second heaven? And you know more than I do, Eric. I couldn't begin to tell you what the first, second, and third heaven are. I know, like in the Mormon religion, I think they say there's 7 heavens, because we used to live up there when I was a kid in the 4th grade the first time. And I remember Mother and Dad saying there was something called Jack Mormons. And a Jack Mormon was somebody who could smoke and drink. And they couldn't advance up the levels of heavens in the Mormon religion. And even they were a little bit, seemed to be racist. Are we on YouTube right now? And that the certain races couldn't advance beyond different levels. I don't know what the third heaven is, and I don't think we have to know. But Eric just told me, you got a scriptural reference for that? Jewish writings talk about different levels of heaven. Okay. Brother, we're going to have to talk about that a little bit more after services. Thank you. Glad you're here today. And your whole family. Let's see, where am I? Okay, yeah, chapter 12. I know a man, such a one, caught up even to the third heaven, and I know such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I know not, but God knows, how he was caught up into paradise, heard unspeakable words. And so, in other words, in this vision, or whether he was there physically, he goes, I heard spiritual things that were just maybe so astounding and so amazing that I can't begin to repeat them. Not lawful for man to utter. On behalf of such a one will I glory, but on my own behalf I will not glory, save in my weakness, maybe when he's talking, using the device for talking like a fool. 6, for I should desire to glory, for if I should desire to glory, I shall not be foolish, for I shall speak the truth, but I forbear, lest any man should account of me above that which he sees of me or hears from me. And so he references to this, but then look what happens in verse 7. By reason of the exceeding greatness of the revelations, that I should not be exalted overmuch, there is given to me a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, to buffet or distract me, that I should not be exalted overmuch. And so he's had these experiences. And what is sort of natural when you have an experience like that? I mean, you might think that you're better than you are, right? Yes, Gus.
Is not having so you are different, pretty different, special.
That you're special and better than other people. Yeah, and so you can think about things like who did Jesus take on the Mount of Transfiguration? And so this thing among the disciples when they walked with Jesus about wanting to be better than the other disciples. John and James's mother, Mama, coming up and say, in your kingdom, can one of my kids sit on your right hand, one on the left-hand side? And so the animosity that we see that created among disciples. And so that sort of thing, maybe we have an experience that you could think of yourself and elevate yourself as more than you are. A lot of people would fall down that, go down that trail. But he says here, to keep him humble, in other words, a thorn in the flesh was given him, a messenger of Satan to buffet or strike him, not buffet, but to buffet, that I should not be exalted over much. Concerning this thing, I besought the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he has said unto me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my weaknesses, and the power of Christ may rest upon me. Okay, so this is some physical malady, and there's some thought that Paul had weak eyesight, or and so he prayed to God 3 times. We know, what did Jesus say about prayer to his disciples? Harley? Pray without ceasing. But he also said, I'll grant you anything you want, right? If you have faith as a mustard seed, you can move this mountain. And so there's this big general assurance of prayer. And here's an example of a prayer that God decided, he always gives an answer. Here he decided to answer it no. And so Paul's got this constant reminder, this physical malady. He knows God's with him. He knows he's an apostle. He knows he's done all these things, but he recognizes this, why God said no, so he could stay humble. And he was humble anyway, right? When we look at 1 Corinthians, in chapter 9, he said that he was different than the rest of the apostles. And why was Paul different than the rest of the apostles?
Years
On the road to Damascus, right? All the other disciples, yes, like a child born out of season, right? And remember this, all the other disciples were invited to follow Jesus Christ, right? Follow after me, I will make you fishers of men. Paul was not invited. He was struck blind on the road to Damascus. He knew about Jesus Christ. He'd helped in the martyrdom of Stephen, and so he'd heard all the arguments about Jesus Christ and rejected. So Jesus sort of slaps him in the face on the road to Damascus, and he's blind, and he hears the voice of Jesus, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? Not, Saul, come follow me, and I'll make a fisher of men. And so he's a little bit different. And so he remembers that, and he repeats that frequently in his letters, that and as Eric said, like a child born out of season. So there's a difference there in his apostleship. And so when he says that I will glory in my weaknesses, that the power of Christ may rest upon me, wherefore, in verse 10, I take pleasure in weaknesses, in injuries, in necessities, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake, for when I'm weak, then am I strong. So he takes pleasure as he reminisces about all these things, and how many of us would do that, and think about the 3 times he's whipped and shipwrecked and things like that. But looking back at it, he takes pleasure in it. And because why? Because his Lord and Savior suffered, and he was suffering too. And so he could have a sharing with Jesus Christ in that sort of suffering. And so if we suffer for righteousness' sake, it shouldn't be our attitude that we lament that, the way they treated me, blah, blah, blah. But take pride in it. The blessing of being able to, Joe Lynn says, the blessing of being able to endure those things and get past them, which reminds me of 1 Corinthians 10:13, which says what? Ray, you know what it is, right? And there's no sin overtaking me, but what such I can endure, and God will give the door, the window, and I can just get away from it. And so everybody's got abilities, right? But here's what God says, and what through the Apostle Paul, is that I'm not going to put something on you that you can't bear and that you can't endure, and if you can't, I'm going to provide escape so you can get away from it. So that nobody can be with the excuse, oh, I had to sin. Remember that comedian Flip Wilson? You do, Eric. Right? You're about that age and genre. And comedian, and he would say, the devil made me do it. Remember that, Dwayne? Yeah, you do. And so he's real funny. And the devil made me do it. Like that's an excuse. I couldn't help myself. The devil made me do it. Not according to 1 Corinthians 10:13. You can stand up to it, or you can get away from it. Kind of like Joseph and Potiphar's wife, right? And he ran away, just got away from it. So many times we don't want to run away from it. We just want to, oh, maybe I can stand up to this. But then Satan fashions himself as a minister of light, minister of righteousness. Some people get sucked into that spider web, Satan, the great spider, and devoured by Satan. Somebody have their hand up that I missed? Ray?
Here, that Paul surely has marveled that it wasn't very marvelous. All these
Yeah.
all these didn't boast.
And they should be glorying about that. He tells them this so that they would have something to glory about. And yes, that he would bear the scars on his body. Yes, Antia? Antia says that because of his experiences that he's very, I guess, loving of us and always willing to give us a second chance. Did I restate that right? Yeah, so he accepts it, but that begs the question, the other apostles, they were, although we don't have a great record of it, we certainly don't have Peter recounting all these things, but they all suffered too, and they were invited, but maybe Paul suffered worse because of it. Hard to know. Yeah, and that's a good point, that this thorn in the flesh came from Satan. It's I think, what did you say? It's a messenger of Satan. So God allowed that. It's kind of I don't like to think about this, but Satan and God, because when you think about Jesus in the 40 days where he's starving himself, he didn't want to have much to do with Satan. But in Job, you see Satan and God talking, negotiating over Job. You also have a reference, it's either in Luke 23 or 24, where Jesus told Peter, Satan asked my permission to sift you like wheat. He granted it. But we also have to remember 1 Corinthians 10:13, that, and so Peter, according to 10:13, could have withstood that, but his faith wasn't advanced as it would be. And so he was not able to. Okay, verse 11 he continues with this foolishness. Verse 11, I'm become foolish. You compelled me. For I should have been commended of you. I shouldn't have had to list these things. They should have known them. I mean, you know, if we know somebody who's suffered, that word gets around pretty quick, right? For nothing was I behind the very chiefest of apostles, though I am nothing. Truly the signs of an apostle were worked among you. Here he is defending his apostleship. The signs of an apostle were worked among you in all patience by signs and wonders and mighty works. We don't really, I mean, we have some record of that, like Sosthenes, who they're in Acts 18. God obviously stepping in to help in that situation. But he did other mighty works that aren't really recorded in Corinth. But here we see this generic reference to them. Verse 13, what is there wherein you were made inferior to the rest of the churches, except it be that I myself was not a burden to you? Forgive me this wrong. And so when we talk about churches, and you remember the Roman church, what was special about them? Chapter 1, maybe chapter 2. Their faith was renowned. Their faith was renowned throughout the world. The faith of the Christians in Rome. So every church has a reputation, right? Unfortunately, the church in Corinth's reputation was they should have been supporting Paul and glorying in him, but they weren't. They were criticizing him and judging him, and now they bounced back from that, right? But he says, forgive me if you feel inferior to the rest of churches. The only reason being you didn't financially support me like you could have, and they would feel guilty about that. And my guess is that the next time they saw him, they would make sure they supported him, and willingly, not out of constraint. So the third time I'm ready to come to you, and I will not be a burden to you. He said, and so what this means is that I'm not looking for your money. For I seek not yours, but I seek you. The children ought not to lay up for the parents, but the parents for the children. And I will most gladly spend as a parent and be spent for your souls. If I love you more abundantly, am I loved the less? But be it so that I did not myself burden you, but being crafty, I caught you with guile. What was Paul's craftiness here? What was he referencing? Not charging them for the gospel. And so there was a method behind his madness, so to speak. I'm become all things to all men. I know there's this element in Corinth that think I'm just maybe doing this for money, that I'm a false apostle. And I'm not gonna allow that argument to be made. I'm gonna offer it for free. And it had his desired effect. He did a great work among those people. 17, did I take advantage of you by any one of them whom I have sent unto you? So he didn't take advantage of them directly, nor by the people that he sent. I exhorted Titus, and I sent the brother with him. Did Titus take any advantage of you? Walk we not in the same spirit? Walk we not in the same steps? So there's this reference to the brother, and it's mentioned about 4 or 5 times. And he sent Titus and the brother. And a lot of people, the Bible scholars, think this is Luke. Whether it is or not, I don't suppose it matters. But it's interesting to think about that. I mean, Luke was certainly active with Paul in his teaching. All right. I think that's the end of a paragraph. That's where we're going to stop. And we'll begin with verse 19 next Sunday. Then that'll be the last class. We'll finish up. Any comments, thoughts, anything? Ricardo? Yeah, he had to get out of town.
Why did you?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, you know, because in Jerusalem, when the disciples were dispersed and all the Christians had to get out of town, the apostles stayed and had some level of protection, I guess, from Jehovah God. And but here we see this example of Paul in Damascus having to be lowered down. So I'm not sure what all that means, but it's interesting. Yes, Karen. Yes, ma'am. And Acts 14:14, Romans 16:7, 1 Thessalonians 1:1 and 2:6. 16:7, 1 Thessalonians 1:1, and chapter 2, verse 6. Lady called me the other day trying to get me to renew my subscription to the Caller Times, and she said, "Tell me your credit card number. Just tell me 2 digits at a time." I said, 0645441. Yeah. All right. Thank you.